Rebecca, thank you so much for being here. Your new book is called Dear Miss Perkins. And Frances Perkins is such an interesting historic figure that most Americans know nothing about.
I love asking people when was the first time you heard of her. A common answer is watching the movie Dirty Dancing because the character Baby is named after Frances Perkins.
Dear Miss Perkins is not primarily about the New Deal. It's not primarily about all of the labor reforms that we still have many of them in place today that we can attribute directly to Frances Perkins's influence and rulemaking. The fact that we don't have child labor. We have Frances Perkins by and large to thank for many of those reforms. There's a lot of very interesting impacts that we are still feeling today that were spearheaded by Frances Perkins. But the thrust of your book has more to do with her assistance to refugees during World War II.
She was the foremost advocate for German Jewish refugees in the first Roosevelt administration. She receives letters from people and she tries to point them in the right direction, navigating a very complex immigration system. One of them was a businessman in Austria, and he was Jewish, and he had a physical disability that he was born with. She had to send a note to the ship in Austria. And then when he reached Ellis Island, her own employees with the INS tried to say, you can't possibly be allowed to immigrate because of this physical disability. And so in order for this poor Jewish Austrian man to come to the US, he needed to have evidence of supporting himself, somebody to support him in case for the first time he couldn't, and the Secretary of Labor to directly intervene twice.
Why is this book called Dear Miss Perkins?
It's about the people who wrote to her. One example from the Dear Miss Perkins letters, which are in the National Archives, is her dentist, Eugene Wiseman, had a cousin who was a Hungarian Jewish man married to an Austrian Jewish woman, and they were trying to immigrate to the US. That physically close proximity of her dentist writing to her on behalf of a family member who was in danger. And the cousin, Andre Verity, was literally deported to a concentration camp on Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, in November 1938. And that was one of the examples of someone who she could not help to immigrate to the US. But there were many examples of people who wrote Dear Miss Perkins, and it was the start of a correspondence that saved multiple people's lives.
She's clearly inserting herself in these specific cases. I would imagine she's being like overtly criticized by people who oppose her, saying, you're not allowed to use your power to sort of like move the levers for individual people. Like what were the criticisms? Today, the idea that somebody would be like, Dear Tony, I really want to come to the United States. Please help me. How do I do that? And then like, they would get a personal letter back from like the Secretary of State. Like that seems preposterous today. And in fact, we would probably accuse that person of like corruption if they were personally helping people to navigate the US immigration system. So, what were people saying about her efforts?
She went out of her way not to draw attention to herself. The first time there was a ship of German Jewish children refugees that she had personally worked to get them into the US, the team that worked together went out of their way to ensure that there was no media coverage.
She has always been a bit of an enigma. She's trying to like fly a little bit below the radar because it's easier to get things done if not everybody is watching you, right? Like that was an easier way to navigate the system. And you even say in your book, consuming the books and media that are now available about Perkins, she stands out for her righteousness. It doesn't make you rich and famous to advocate for refugees. It doesn't make you rich and famous to advocate for child labor laws. It doesn't make you rich and famous to help create programs that save people from homelessness. But I love the idea that what she stands out for is her righteousness,